certain pious man, and a certain pious man observed him doing so. The latter said to him, "Worthless one, for what reason are you throwing stones from property that is not yours into property that is yours?" So this is a sort of Jewish Zen koan here, right? Because he's throwing stones from his property, what he would call his property, what we would call his property, into the public domain. And yet this pious man says, you're throwing stones from property that is not yours into property that is yours. And I also just want to note the word reika, which here is italicized, from it's really an empty one, empty head, fool. And I think that it is noteworthy that he's not called a rasha, he's not called an evildoer, a wrongdoer, but an empty head, which really means he's being called a fool. What you're doing is foolish. It's not, it's wrong also, but it's foolish. So now the story continues. Some days later, he was forced to sell his field from which he had thrown the stones. And he was walking in the same public domain into which he had thrown them. And he stumbled on those same stones. He said, "That pious man spoke well to me when he said, 'For what reason are you throwing stones from property that is not yours into your own property?'" So let's take that apart a little bit. Halakha often asks of us a paradigm shift, to think about a reality in a way that is different from the way that we are used to thinking about it. So one of the questions that's being raised here is, what does it mean to say that property is mine? And what the Chassid is saying is, it's not saying to the owner, you are the owner right now, but you are not the absolute owner of this property. And of course, the absolute owner of everything is God. We'll come back to that. So you are a temporary resident, but it is not absolutely yours. And nothing is absolutely yours. And when we think that something is absolutely ours, we tend to develop a kind of hubris that allows us to treat others as we should not. But he is also saying to this person, you, and perhaps in some ways, this is a more important aspect of the story. When you're throwing those stones into the public domain, what is your thought? Your thought is, that's no man's land. I can throw stones there because no one in particular owns it. So that's as good a place as any to throw the stones. But the Chassid tells him, actually, everyone owns the public domain, including you. And when you throw stones into the public domain, you will suffer as well as your fellow human beings. So if we think about that in terms of polluting, again, let's say a factory that is spewing toxins into the air or releasing them into a river or in some other way polluting, or let's face it, my spewing garbage somewhere. In my mind somewhere is, it's not a problem because that area is not mine. And this story is saying, it is yours, it is everyone's. So it means that when you do that, you definitely are harming other people who have a stake in that area or that resource. People are going to be breathing the air that into which you are spewing toxins. But just as importantly, although you may think otherwise, you have a stake in that area as well. And without sort of going prophetic on you, we can see today that as pollution gets worse and worse, broad swaths of people and countries are being affected by it. And so people who thought, including us, that we could sort of throw the pollution out there and it will be someone else's problem, realize that we are stakeholders, that there is an ecosystem in which everything is interconnected. And so when we harm the environment, at the end of the day, we're harming ourselves. This story to me encapsulates the rabbinic thinking about the responsibility that we have to others, and that the way we think about our own property also has to change. And let me clarify something that I did not clarify. One of the reasons that it is important to understand that we do not have absolute ownership of our property is that it means that limits can be placed on how we use our property. We need to use our property, and the halakha is going to insist on this. We can only use our property in a way that makes us a good neighbor, that does not impinge unjustly upon our neighbors. And so it may turn out that there are forms of land use that will be forbidden to me. Ownership does not ensure an unconditional use of that which is mine. And that, I think, is part of what the Chassid meant when he said, this land is not yours. In some way, your rights are limited. So I want to back up, even though mainly I want to talk about rabbinic sources. I do want to look at a number of biblical sources and some rabbinic teachings connected to them, because I want to zoom out and say, when we say that what is ours is not absolutely ours, is yes, in part because we have responsibilities to others, which is the point that I just made, but also because the earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof, Lashem ha'aretz u'meloah, and we are essentially tenants. And we have to pay good attention to what the landlord asks of us. So let's go back to the beginning and quote some verses that I am sure you know, and talk about how the first two verses are in perhaps creative tension, but certainly in tension with each other. And so as part of the creation story, after humanity is created, we are told in Genesis 1, verse 28, God blessed them, and God said to them, be fertile and increase, fill the earth and master it, and rule the fish of the sea, the birds and the sky, and all the living things that creep on earth. Now, one word in this verse, or I guess you could really say two, that have been considered controversial as the environmental conversation has taken place, are the words in Hebrew, vikivshuha, master it, in the sense you could translate it as conquer it, uridu, which really has more the sense of ruling over something. And so this raises the question of whether we're being told that as masters, we can use the earth's resources at will. Is that the message that God is said to be transmitting in Genesis 1, verse 28? And as a matter of fact, there was a scientist by the name of White who famously said that the whole environmental crisis is due to the Bible and the Judeo-Christian tradition. And he pointed to this verse in particular. This verse shows that Jewish tradition and Christian tradition regards the world simply as a servant to humanity to be mastered at will. If we didn't have this form of thinking, we wouldn't be in trouble. Well, I don't think so, but I also want to say that this verse has to be read, and I'm hardly the first person to say this, in conjunction with Genesis 2, verse 15. Now, famously, the Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 are considered by Bible scholars to be two creation stories, because if you read them, they are very different descriptions of how the world is created. And if we take a literary approach to the Bible, then we say it's not that they're just two stories and they disagree with each other. There are two stories that an editor decided to put together. And that presumably means that we are meant to read both stories in creative tension with one another. And this is arguably an example. So Genesis 2:15, we are told that there is the Garden of Eden, and the Lord God took the man and placed him in the garden, le'ovda u'leshomra. We can translate it alliteratively, to till it and to tend it. So that means that yes, humanity is meant to cultivate that which is there, not just to let it stand and not to interfere with the natural world, but also to tend it, to care for it. So the involvement of humanity in the natural world must be accompanied by caring for it. And notice something else here too. The difference between the implicit relationship between God and humanity in Genesis 1 and in Genesis 2 when it comes to our role in using the resources of the world. In Genesis 1, God seems to send us off into the world that, in a sense, now you are actually at a much more modest level, but like me, you too are masters. Go out and master the world. Whereas in Genesis 2, we basically are day laborers for God. Right? God puts us into the garden to take care of the garden, to work it, and to tend to it, almost like as I say, a sharecropper or a hired hand. A very different relationship. And there is a rabbinic teaching in Kohelet Rabbah, Ecclesiastes Rabbah, that picks up on this and talks about the consequences of not tilling and tending. And it quotes a verse from Kohelet, chapter 7, verse 13. Re'eh et ma'aseh ha'elohim, ki mi yuchal letaken et asher ivto. See God's works, for who can make right that which one has made crooked? And now the Midrash says, when God created the first human, God took him and showed him all the trees in the Garden of Eden. God then said to him, see how pleasing and praiseworthy my creations are. All that I have created is for your sake. Be mindful that you do not degrade and destroy my world, for if you do, no one after you will be able to repair it. So God is saying that this midrash is expanding upon this notion of God putting us in the garden to till intended. And God is saying this is a grave responsibility, because while I am the creator and you cannot create in the same way that I can, here's something that you do have the power to do. You have the power to destroy. And at a certain point, if you destroy what I have made, no one will be able to come after you and repair the damage. So understand what a heavy responsibility you have. I was doing some teaching on environmentalism this Sunday. It was actually an interesting project. This was JCC Detroit, and they had an art installation by 3 artists that had to do with environmentalism. And I was teaching what I was teaching. And one of them said, when we pollute the world, we are not just betraying our descendants because we're leaving them with this degraded world. We're also betraying our ancestors. And our ancestors gave us a world and intended for us to guard it and to care for it. And in a way, that's what this midrash is saying. God is handing over the world to us and saying, if you degrade it, you have betrayed me. I'm using stronger language than that's what's here, but nonetheless. I wanted to look at one more source, and then if people want to, I'm going to see if people have any questions and comments. Source number 4 is from Perek Shira. Perek Shira is literally chapter or chapters of song, but Shira here also has the meaning of praise. It's a medieval work, that emanates from mystical circles. And it is based on the idea, it's really based on the biblical idea, that all of nature sings God's praise, however one wants to understand it. And obviously one way of understanding it is what we saw above, is that when we look at the amazing variety and beauty of the natural world, we realize how great God is to have created all of this. And what's interesting about Perek Shira is, although it starts out with the usual suspects, right? It talks about how the heavens praise God, how the earth praises God, clouds and so on. The very first one is familiar to us from Psalm 19. The way Perek Shira works is that different parts of nature or different creatures are mentioned, and then a verse is put in their mouth. And as if to say, this is the song that the heavens, the earth, we'll see the grasshopper and so on sing. Now, Perek Shira arbitrarily puts verses in the mouths of various creatures, but unifying idea is simply by existing, that creature gives praise to God, shows the greatness of God's creation. So the first one, again from Psalm 19, the heavens are saying, the heavens speak of God's kavod, and the skies tell of God's handiwork. Hashamayim misaprin kavod el, uma'aseh yadav magid harakia, the psalm that we say in Psukei de Zimra of Shabbat. The earth says also, this is familiar to us from Psalm 24, the earth is saying, the earth and everything in it are God's, the inhabited area and all that dwell in it. Ladonai haaretz umuloa tevel v'yoshvei va. But, and there's 3 dots there, I don't know if you can see it, we're skipping way down now in Perek Shira. And who else is offering praise? grasshoppers, locusts, spiders, and my favorite, the fly. You know, we don't usually, when we think about the majesty of God's world, you know, the heavens, the earth, all of that, yeah, we get it. That seems very majestic. But I think that Perek Shirah is saying very brilliantly, and this is actually based on a midrash about King David and the spider, that every part of nature speaks God's praise, which means that every part of nature is to be appreciated as part of God's plan. We should not say, oh yeah, lions, tigers, the earth, the heavens, yeah, that's pretty good. I like that. That's a good creation. But flies, who needs that? The answer is, and science confirms this for us, there's an ecosystem, and at the end of the day, every creature, however small, however annoying for that matter, is part of the system. And in that sense, it offers praise to God. And the praises that these various creatures offer don't necessarily seem to have to do with them per se. I mean, I'll just read through the fly's praise. I don't really see any connection between it and the fly, but so be it. The fly says, when Israel is not busying itself with Torah, is saying, the voice said, call out. And he said, what shall I call out? All flesh is grass, and all its grace is as the flower of the field. Also biblical verses. The grass withers, the flower fades, but the word of our Eloha shall endure forever. Okay. So this is Perek Shirah, and I'm moving back to this to say that when we talk about the obligations that we have towards our neighbors and the ways in which we need to limit our use of what has been given to us out of consideration for our neighbors, that ultimately this goes back to the fact that nothing is absolutely ours. Everything is absolutely God's. And we have just been privileged to be here for as long as we are here and to use and to care for whatever has been placed in our hands. I'm going to stop sharing for a moment and just see if anybody has any questions or comments that you would like to make. And if not, we'll head right back. Nope. Okay.
Can Harry say something?
Just a minute.
Yes,
I just
anybody
want
can-
to ask. I just want to
anything
ask this question. Has anyone ever considered the alternate meaning of master, which is not to master over something, but to master knowledge? In other words, maybe when God is saying, master the world, he's saying to learn as much about it as we can so that we can keep it and preserve it and protect it.
I like that thought, and the whatever you want to call it, the scholar in me requires me to point out that the verse says, be fertile and increase, fill the earth and master it and rule the fish of the sea, the birds of the sky, and all the living things that creep on earth. I think the straightforward meaning of the verse is not about mastering knowledge, unless you want to say that you should master knowledge to know how to relate to those beings. I would put that in the category of midrash, and as a rabbinic scholar, I'm all in favor of midrash. And I think the straightforward meaning of the verse is that human beings are going to master, or that they are at the top of the chain, and they are going to master the rest of the world. It's interesting, there are some philosophers, including Maimonides, who says, don't be so sure that the purpose of God's creation is humanity, to create humanity, for humanity to exist. God is mysterious. who knows why God created the world? We cannot be sure. And Maimonides says this by way of ensuring that we are humble. Nonetheless, to me, this is a very hierarchical verse, and it does suggest mastery over God's creation.
I don't agree.
That's okay. That's what makes a horse race. Okay. Okay. I don't know. I think it was Harry and then Howard.
Yes, Eliezer, a long time ago, I took a course on environmental ethics with Eric Katz, whom you may know.
Okay.
And one of the readings that we had in that course dealt with the question of whether we are allowed to obligate future generations about environmental decisions that we make, and whether or not, handing on what we have to our children and insisting that they preserve it is what they might want. And I find this a very interesting, problematical, not saying that I necessarily agree with it, but I'd just like to know, where does Jewish tradition stand on that particular issue of whether we are allowed to obligate our future generations to, in particular, environmental decisions that they may not agree with and may not be appropriate at that time?
Well, Harry, I would need more details. That's a rather large question.
The general proposition: are we allowed to obligate future generations to preserve the Adirondacks, for example? Maybe the people living in the Adirondacks or the people living in the United States want to use it for something else. Maybe there's a more important use that it's going to have in the future, and we can't preserve it.
Yeah, I don't think that I don't know of any basis for saying that Generation A, having made particular environmental decisions, can expect a future generation to agree with that decision. But for me, it's somewhat of a moot question. And what I mean by that is, we are all bound by some larger environmental responsibilities. And now the question becomes, how do we fulfill those responsibilities? So what we do with the Adirondacks has to do with that question. And yes, one could argue that what's environmentally responsible is to leave the Adirondacks pristine. And someone else could argue that we can manage it and still be and have more human use of the Adirondacks and still be environmentally responsible. My son-in-law Andrew works for the Pine Barrens Conservancy in southern Jersey, the largest conservancy of its type. And that conservancy, one of its goals is to see how a balance can be created between having human habitation in that area and maintaining, the ecosystem. So to me, it's somewhat of a moot question. I think the common denominator is, are you being environmentally responsible in good faith? Are you considering all of the problems and having as at the top of your list a concern for the environment? Of course, it's more. There are cases where it's more complicated. Can we stop logging in a certain area because the spotted owl may become extinct? I don't think there's any one right answer to that question. But what I would say is, people at least have to see that it's a question, and they have to think about what will be best for the environment. They can't simply say, well, we need housing right now, we need money right now, so this is what we have to do. Next time we'll talk about fracking, to look at a specific case. And that's an interesting case where people have significant financial needs. Fracking takes place for the most part, in economically depressed areas where people have few other means of income. And they say, you know, it's all very nice that you want to take care of the environment, but hey, my pockets are empty. That's an important question, and it shouldn't be ignored. So, yeah, Howard.
Thank you. The second verse that you quoted, Genesis 2:15. So the last word is ulashamra, right? And then it's translated there as tended, I think. Whereas I usually think of shamra as guarded, and the two are related, I think. Although tended to me is more of a proactive action, and guarded is more of a defensive word. And I'm just, I mean, are both those terms correct, or
Well,
why do you
okay.
think translate it that way?
Think about farm. Well, first of all, because it sounds nicer, and I'm not the first one to translate that way. But more seriously, you're a farmer. When you plow the earth and you plant seeds, you're tilling the ground. Now you've planted and weeds grow. You remove those weeds, you uproot those weeds. That is in the category, arguably, of tending to it. So there is the creative act of causing the earth to flourish, but at the same time, you have to, you can use the word guard, but both for the sake of what's growing, but also for the world around it, you have to guard it, you have to tend it. And I think that is a real difference, excuse me, between those two. The Seder, shall we return to business at hand?
Yes.
Okay, let's do it. Okay, so where are we? Shira, we did. Story, we did. Okay. Now, the chapter 2 of the Mishnah of Bava Batra deals with conflicting property use, or again, what Rambam calls very elegantly, Hilchot Shchenim, laws of neighbors. And so here, in very concrete terms, rabbis figure out what are the ways in which I need to limit my own property use so as not to have an adverse effect on my neighbor. Now, I want to say at the outset, just to manage your expectations, the rabbis are basically talking about these issues in a very small bore way. They're not talking, obviously, about major factories. They're talking about two landowners who have problems like they want to dig wells or things like that. As often is true, when halakha talks about particular issues, it's not always easy to extrapolate meaningfully from these small board discussions to larger policy issues. But it doesn't mean that we shouldn't study those sources and at least give some thought to how we might extrapolate from them to larger issues. So the very first Mishnah in this chapter says, one may not dig a cistern near his fellow cistern, right? A cistern is simply a pit that is meant to gather rain, and it's generally coated with lime and plaster so that there's no leakage. Right? And this is taking place, of course, in the land of Israel, where there's a rainy season and a dry season. So you want to have a cistern so that when there is rain, you will gather it for future use. Nor may he dig a ditch, cave, water channel, laundry pool, unless it is 3 handbreadths away from his fellow's wall, and he must plaster it with lime. Right, so these are all projects that involve water. These are going to contain water. And so you have to, A, distance it a certain distance from the property line, and you have to, and specifically, you are distancing it, as it says, from your fellow's wall. Okay, there's a wall at the property line. Your neighbor has a wall. If you dig your cistern too close to the property line, you may undermine that wall, the foundations of the wall, and it will collapse. And even if you don't dig that cistern close to the wall, if you don't coat that cistern with lime and plaster, there will be seepage into the ground. And once again, that seepage could have the effect of undermining the wall. So now, by the way, at the risk of stating the obvious, my neighbor has that obligation as well. So that means that if this is the wall, each of us has to distance 3 handbreadths from that wall so that neither of us will cause it damage. And my point here is that one might say, my property is my property. I can use it at will up to the boundary line. You can't tell me that I have to retreat from that boundary line because of possible damage that I will do to others. And if you say to me, well, but if you do that, you may cause damage to your neighbor, you can say, well, if that happens, we'll go to court, and if I'm found responsible, I will pay you. In other words, one of the crossroads in terms of how we deal with conflicting property rights is, and we will continue to see this, is the model litigation or regulation? In other words, do we say, go ahead, knock yourself out. You use your property, I'll use my property. And if one of us claims that the other caused damage, then we'll work it out in court. Or, and that's the majority rabbinic approach, is to say, we don't wait for that to happen. We create regulations that prevent that from coming to pass. And when we do that, we limit your rights. Now, of course, this is a very contemporary conversation in many areas of law with regard to businesses. Sometimes business owners feel that they're being overly regulated. And there's not necessarily a simple answer to that question, right? How far do you go in creating regulations to prevent, an accident or damage to others, even though that impinges upon the rights of the owner or the business person? And to what extent can the business person say, listen, something might happen, and if it does, then okay, you'll take me to court. But in the meantime, by impinging on my business, you're creating expenses and limiting my business in some important ways. And again, there's no right answer, but what we're looking at is the problem. And now I want us to look at a Mishnah where arguably we see explicitly these two views, the regulation view and the litigation view. So the Mishnah says, a tree may not be grown within 25 cubits of a cistern, or within 50 cubits if it is a carob or a sycamore, whether it is on a higher or on the same level. Okay, this simply has to do with the size of the roots of various trees. So it is assumed that most trees, their roots grow no longer than 25 cubits, and certain trees more, carobs and sycamores. And of course, these are trees that are very common in Israel. If you've ever had a fresh carob off the tree, Like when I was in school for Tu B'Shvat, they used to give us dried carob, which first of all was not the most attractive fruit in the world. And second of all, was dry as dust. And I was thinking like, if this is supposed to be, the fruits of Israel, all right. But then when you have a carob fresh off the tree, not bad. Okay, but I digress. So, and then the Mishnah is saying whether you measure 25 cubits, whether it's level ground or what, if it's higher or the tree is here and the cistern is here. Okay, so that's the general rule. Now, why is there such a rule? Because I have a cistern. The cistern is plastered, and that's so that there's no leakage. Now, my neighbor plants a tree. The roots are growing. If he plants that tree within 25 cubits of my cistern, there's a very good chance that the roots will invade the cistern and then it will no longer hold water. So that's the reason for this prohibition. Now, we go on to say, so if the cistern was there first, the tree shall be cut down and compensation given. This is a strange rule, and we'll come back to this. Right? So if I plant the tree after the cistern is there, I do have to cut down the tree to prevent damage to the cistern, but yet I'm compensated for the tree. We'll come back to it. If the tree was there first, it shall not be cut down. If it is in doubt which was there first, the tree shall not be cut down. And that rule, by the way, is because of a rabbinic legal principle, hamotzi mechavero alav hara'aya. If you want to take money out of my pocket, as it were, you are the one who has to present proof that it belongs in your pocket and not mine. So in this case, if we're not sure which was there first, the person who's demanding payment must prove that in fact he is owed money, that the cistern was there first. You can't do it, you can't collect. Okay, good. Now we have a different view. Rabbi Yosef says, even if the cistern was there before the tree, it should not be cut down. This one digs within his own domain, and the other one plants within his own domain. Now, in my translation, I didn't include the letter word she, because that is in the original, in this version, and it's not, some versions don't have the shin. Afal pisha bar kodemet, even though the cistern is first before the tree, lo yikot, you don't cut down the tree, she, because ze chofer b'tok shalo, v'ze notea b'tok shalo, because this one is digging in his property, and this one is planting in his property. Why is that important? Without the shin, the end of the Mishnah can simply be the ruling, namely, whether the tree is before the cistern or whether the cistern is before the tree, the ruling is the tree is not cut down, and this one digs within his own domain, and this one plants within his own domain. Right? That's the consequence. Okay, we do what we do. Neither has a claim on the other. But the shin suggests another possibility, which is that Rabbi Yossi is introducing a legal principle that explains his ruling, namely that the reason that we don't cut down the tree, even if it's planted after the cistern was already dug, is because, and you could say this is a sort of a libertarian view perhaps, that's the way of the world. This one plants in his field, this one digs in his field. We do not restrict the rights of a person to use his land as he sees fit. And once again, if I damage my neighbor's cistern because the roots of my tree invade that person's cistern, then maybe that person can take me to court and we'll worry about it then. But until then, I can plant my tree where I want. And I do want to point out, let's imagine that the cistern is very close to the boundary line. Then it means that if I have an orchard, right, the person on the other side of the boundary line has an orchard and wants to plant trees, he's going to have to distance that tree 25 cubits, which is as much as 30 feet. It's not a small amount. So it is arguably a major restriction. And Rabbi Yossi says, we do not impose that restriction. Now, a question arises because of these two readings in the Mishnah of whether Rabbi Yossi is disagreeing only in this case or cases like it, or Rabbi Yossi in principle is saying we do not put limits on how people use their property, and if damage occurs, we go to court. Why could we say that this case is different? Well, think about it. If the cistern is here and I plant a tree, it's going to take quite some time for the roots to grow long enough to to pierce the walls of the cistern, A. And B, there's no guarantee that that will happen. Maybe the roots will grow this way. Maybe they'll grow that way. Maybe they'll grow the other way. So it's something that is far off in the future, and there's no guarantee that the person planting the tree will actually cause damage to the cistern. So it may be that Rabbi Yossi in this case says we do not limit the right of the person who wants to plant trees anywhere in that person's property. Whereas to go back to this Mishnah 2:1, in this case, Rabbi Yossi might well agree, yeah, you can't dig a cistern within 3 handbreadths of the wall, because the minute that you do that, you're going to weaken the wall. And when you fill that ditch or laundry pool or whatever it is with water, it's sure as shooting that some water will seep out, and there's an excellent chance that you will weaken the wall. So Rabbi Yossi's lenient position, or lenient for the potential tortfeasor, the person who might cause damage, is limited to that case. That is a possibility. But if we have the reading she, then it would seem to be a general principle. And in fact, the Talmud assumes that Rabbi Yossi is stating a general principle. Even if we rule in accordance with Rabbi Yossi, I don't want to get too complicated here, and we will see a little bit more about this next week. The consensus of halachas is that we do not accept the position of Rabbi Yossi, that we do regulate land use, and that the owner of the land has to anticipate possible damage that he might cause to others. Okay, any questions now that people want to ask? Okay, so let's 1 second. Let's go on. Now, if we look at the Tosefta, number 9, Bava Batra, we will see that the Tosefta is a collection of Tanaitic teachings. Tanaim live from the time of the destruction of the Second Temple, around 70, until around the year 200. And their teachings are the ones that are included in the Mishnah. Obviously, not all of them, a selection of those teachings. And the Tosefta is a companion collection of Tanaitic teachings. It seems to have been edited shortly after the Mishnah was edited. And one of the ways in which the Tosefta is important is that it often contains variant versions of teachings that are found in the Mishnah. And here is an interesting case. What does the Tosefta say? Regarding the case of the cistern and the trees, the Tosefta says, Rabbi Yossi permits planting trees within 25 cubits of a neighbor's cistern. So here Rabbi Yossi is explicitly allowing ab initio someone to plant a tree within 25 cubits of a neighbor's cistern, because fields are meant to be populated with trees. It's important that trees be planted. So here we reach a tricky wicket or sticky wicket, which is that now halacha is taking economic considerations into account. In other words, it may be that the guy who's planting the trees is potentially causing damage to the neighbor. But because we think that having trees planted is so valuable economically, we favor the rights of the person planting the tree over the person who is digging the cistern. I think we can all see how we are now finding ourselves on a slippery slope, according to Rabbi Yossi. Because how do we determine whose economic interests are more important? That is easier said than done. And apropos of that, let's look at one more Mishnah. I think then we'll stop, unless there are any questions. So number 10, we have a Mishnah that says as follows. Animal carcasses, graves, and tanneries must be distanced 50 cubits from a town. This Mishnah is also found in the same chapter. And notice here, we're dealing with a slightly different situation. In the previous Mishnayot, we're dealing with neighbors, two individuals, and there's a potential clash between them. The question is, what are their relative rights and responsibilities? Here, we're talking about a town, a community, and the question is, what rights do they have to be protected from various forms of pollution? So animal carcasses, graves, and tanneries must be distanced 50 cubits from a town. I don't know whether anyone here has ever been near a tannery. You don't want to be near a tannery. It's got an incredibly pungent odor that is not a pleasant one. Okay, so that's why a tannery would be distanced 50 cubits from a town. A tannery, now, with regard to the tannery, there's an additional requirement, not just that it be 50 cubits away. A tannery may be set up only to the east of a town. Now, remember that we're in the land of Israel, right? And so the wind is blowing in from the ocean, from the Mediterranean. So if the tannery is to the east of the town, it's downwind. So the people in town will not have to suffer from the pungent odors from the tannery. Rabbi Akiva says it may be set up on any side save the west, and he agrees it must be distanced 50 cubits from the town. So Rabbi Akiva says, yeah, the town, you can set up your tannery in such a way that the town is downwind from the tannery, which would be the case if it were in the west. However, you can place the tannery on the north or the south of the town, even though there is a greater possibility that the residents of the town will experience the odors of the tannery if it's built there than if it's built downwind in the east. So now we have to ask ourselves, what's the question behind the question, right? Why is this even coming up? Why don't we just tell people, build the tannery in the east, and that's the end of the deal? Obviously, we're talking about a situation where there are various considerations. Building it in a certain place will bring me closer to my supplier. Building it in a certain place will be more difficult for me to build the tannery, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So at some level, this Breita is about balancing the rights of the community with the economic needs of the business person, of the tanner. And so the problem becomes, how stringent are we in requiring the tanner to distance himself from the town, even though there may be some economic disadvantages for the tanner? And to what extent, like Rabbi Akiva, are we a little bit more lenient? So I know that in these sources, we have not received any definitive answers, but what is important and instructive, and one of the things I want you to take away, is that the Tanaim, the rabbis, are aware of, are alive to the complexity of many environmental decisions. And this is really important when we talk about environmental responsibility. It's not enough to say we shouldn't pollute. We do need to think seriously about all of the actors and how we will do right by all of those actors to the extent possible. Easier said than done, without question. Okay, so that's my story, and I'm sticking to it. Just see if there are any questions, and if not, I'll wish you all a good evening. Okay, well,
I just had one kind of a comment about that last section about the tannery and the
Sure.
graveyard.
Yeah.
So in Yerushalayim, this was in the 60s and 70s. I don't know when that ended, but there was a road that went down to Givat Shaul. It was outside of the western part of town, sparsely populated in those days. At the top of the road, there was a tannery that was the most unbelievably terrible smelling place. At the end of that road is the cemetery of Givat Shaul. And I worked in the psychiatric hospital that was in the middle of that road. So I don't know where the psychiatric hospital, belongs in terms of this whole thing, but the tannery and the cemetery was really an example of something that was in an out of the way place and away from the town. Of course, now it is not, but the tannery is no longer there.
okay, so you are, maybe put in the category of coming attractions. Right, so one of the problems that arises very often, especially today, is this arises a lot in this country, but it's arisen in Israel too. Here it's usually or very often about pig farmers. You're a pig farmer, and again, your farm creates a reach nichoach, a very pungent odor, and people, there's a town not so nearby, but now there's a development and the town builds out. And now the suburbs come very close to the pig farmers. So what's the deal? Do we say to the people who have built close to the pig farm, hey, the pig farm was there. I mean, it's going back to the mission about the tree and the cistern. The pig farm was there, and you knew the pig farm was there, so deal with it. However, there have been many court cases here and some in Israel as well, where the court has favored the rights of the residents and said to the pig farmers, you are going to either have to relocate or do something to reduce the inconvenience to the residents. And this goes back to the Tosefta that says that we favor the planting of trees. So even though people, both people have rights, the law sometimes, in effect, follows social and economic policy and says, in this case, we're giving more rights to one neighbor rather than the other, including the neighbor that's the latecomer, including cases where it's.
But what's the point of the regulation if there's no teeth, right? You can't enforce the 50-meter rule because
Let's see the other screen.
You can't enforce it.
Well, yeah, I mean, you can't enforce the rule because, it doesn't matter which one came first. If you're always going to favor the tree planter, or in this case, the people building houses, then what's the point of having that rule in the first place?
Well, in the case of the, what's it called again? The tannery, that rule is not for the sake of the tanner. That rule is for the sake of the town. So what that rule says is, in any case, you cannot be within 50 cubits. And if it turns out that you are in 50 cubits, not because it's your fault, but because the town expands, you may still be in trouble. But those are not contradictory. They're both true. They're both bad news for the tanner, but they're not contradictory.
Eliezer, at the beginning, the use of the word master, when you shall, that man shall have master over a number of things. We assume the word master means absolute control, but is that really, as you go through it, were there other derivations of the word master that would be different than you have absolute control?
So the Hebrew word is kavash, which in some ways is even more troubling than master. I mean, literal means to conquer, but really kavash often has the sense of containing. It's like you're, there's something about it that may be disturbing to us. And my answer for myself, and if it works for you, fine, and if it doesn't, I understand, is to say that the Torah is saying two things simultaneously, and they live in dynamic tension with each other. One of the qualities of human beings is that we have the incredible ability to manipulate and master the resources that we are given. I mean, think about all of the advances in science and technology. Those involve a tremendous amount of mastering. And most of us, I think, would say, thank God that those things have been done. And sometimes they can go too far in a number of ways. We're dealing with AI now. It's becoming tricky, the use of artificial intelligence. Could it get out of hand? It seems that that is a possibility. So therefore, there is also the obligation of Lishon Ra, to guard the world, and I would say really in part to guard the world against us. We have to make sure that we do not wreak havoc. I mean, in general, I will just say that when I come across difficult texts, my own tendency is to accept the text for what it says and then to engage with it in whatever way I have to engage with it. I don't know that we'll get to it, but there are a number of rabbinic texts about the prohibition of bal tashchid, of cutting down a fruit tree, that say that if the tree is worth more for its wood, let's say it's a cherry tree, than for the fruit that it's producing, you may cut down the tree. Now that's an absolute commodification of a natural resource of the tree, and I think is coming to a radically different conclusion than what the Torah suggests. That bothers me tremendously, but there you have it. That's also part of rabbinic tradition. And I think it's important for us to know that and to wrestle with it.
Thank you.
Okay, folks, Ad Kan. Have a good evening. Hope to see you next week.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
There, have a good night.
Thank you.
Bye.
Yeah.